New York City, Sunday morning, November 6, 1977. Leroy Nicholas Barnes is eating breakfast when his lawyer calls. The New York Times Magazine, the lawyer says. You need to see it. Barnes sends someone to get a copy. He is 40 years old. He has been running the most visible drug operation in New York City for the better part of a decade. He has beaten every case the government has brought against him, 4 arrests, 4 acquittals or dismissals. He has appeared in court so many times and walked out so many times that the press has given him a name. Mr. Untouchable. The magazine arrives. Barnes opens it. On the cover, his own face. He is wearing a 3-piece suit, a fur coat, sunglasses. He is leaning against an expensive car. He looks, deliberately and precisely, like a man who is daring someone to do something about it. The headline above his photograph reads, Mr. Untouchable. Barnes looks at the cover for a long moment. He feels something he will later describe as pride. He should feel something else. 400 miles south in Washington, D.C., President Jimmy Carter is also reading the Sunday papers. He opens the New York Times Magazine. He sees the same cover. He sees a drug dealer on the front page of America's most prestigious newspaper, in a fur coat, daring the federal government to come after him. Carter picks up the phone. He calls the DEA. Who is this man, he asks, and why isn't he in prison? The DEA administrator, Peter Bensinger, has a file on Nicky Barnes. A very thick file. He explains the previous arrests, the acquittals, the legal maneuvering, the difficulty of building a case that would stick. Carter listens. Build one, he says. The phone call lasts 4 minutes. 4 months later, Nicky Barnes is convicted on federal drug conspiracy charges. He receives a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. In Harlem, a man who has spent 10 years being everything Barnes was not, reads the news from a cell of his own. Frank Lucas, already convicted, already cooperating, already dismantling the invisible empire's architecture for Richie Roberts' case file. He reads about Nicky Barnes. He says nothing publicly. But the people who know him say he shook his head, just once, because Frank Lucas had understood something for 10 years that Nicky Barnes had never learned. Visibility is not power. Visibility is a target. Leroy Nicholas Barnes was born in Harlem in 1933, 4 years before Frank Lucas arrived from North Carolina. They grew up in the same neighborhood, shaped by the same streets, defined by the same limited options and the same unlimited hunger that Harlem in the 1940s and 1950s produced in its young men. But they were shaped differently. Frank Lucas had come from the South. He carried the specific survival knowledge of a black man in Jim Crow America, the knowledge that visibility was danger, that the wrong kind of attention from the wrong kind of people was lethal, that the safest path through a hostile world was the path that nobody was watching. He had brought this knowledge north with him. It had become, in his hands, the foundational principle of the most successful criminal organization in American history. Nicky Barnes had grown up in Harlem itself. He had not carried the South's lessons. He had grown up in a world where visibility, in certain forms, was currency, where the man who could walk down 116th Street and have everyone acknowledge him was a man who had made it, who had built something, who mattered in the specific way that Harlem valued mattering. Barnes had started, like most of his contemporaries, at the street level. Heroin use in his teens, dealer in his 20s, mid-level operator by his 30s. He was arrested multiple times. He did time, federal time in Lewisburg, where he encountered a man who would change his understanding of what the drug trade could be. That man was Frank Lucas. The relationship between Frank Lucas and Nicky Barnes is one of the most consequential and most under-examined relationships in the history of Harlem's underground economy. They were, at various points, business partners. Barnes was one of the distributors who moved blue magic through certain channels, one of the street-level operators who benefited from the quality and price of Frank Lucas's product. They were, at other points, competitors, as Barnes built his own operation, the Council, which eventually rivaled Frank Lucas's in scale if not in sophistication. And they were, in some fundamental sense, mirrors of each other. Two men of comparable intelligence, comparable ambition, comparable organizational capability. Two men who had looked at the same landscape and drawn different conclusions about how to navigate it. Frank Lucas concluded, "Be invisible." Nicky Barnes concluded, "Be untouchable." These are not the same thing. By the early 1970s, Nicky Barnes had constructed something that, in its organizational structure, showed clear evidence of having learned from Frank Lucas's model. He called it the Council. 7 men, each running their own operation, coordinated through a formal structure that met regularly, made collective decisions, shared resources, and, in theory, presented law enforcement with a distributed target that was harder to dismantle than a hierarchical organization with a single point of failure at the top. The Council was genuinely sophisticated. Barnes had understood the compartmentalization principle, the idea that an organization built from isolated cells is more resilient than one where a single arrest can collapse the whole structure. He had understood the value of organizational redundancy. He had understood that the drug trade, operated at scale, required management systems beyond the personal relationships and informal authority that street-level operations ran on. He had learned these things, in part, from Frank Lucas. What he had not learned, what he had observed and rejected or simply failed to absorb, was the discipline of invisibility. Frank Lucas was invisible because he chose to be, because he understood that visibility was a liability, because he was willing to eat neck bones at the corner of restaurants and drive unremarkable cars and wear brown suits while generating $1 million a day. Nicky Barnes was visible because he wanted to be. Because in his specific psychology, in the specific way his ambition had formed around the Harlem street culture's valuation of recognized status, being known was not a risk to be managed. It was a goal to be achieved. Barnes dressed spectacularly. Mink coats, tailored suits, custom-made shoes. He drove Mercedeses and BMWs at a time when such cars were still rare enough in Harlem to turn heads. He wore jewelry, not discreet jewelry, but the specific, deliberate jewelry of a man communicating his net worth to anyone who could see him. He was seen. He was recognized everywhere in Harlem. Not as a drug dealer, he maintained the specific legal plausible deniability of someone who had beaten 4 arrests and understood that what could be proven was not the same as what was known. But as a successful man, a powerful man, a man who had built something, he gave interviews, not about the drug business, he was careful about that, but about Harlem, about the community, about the legitimate businesses he used to launder the operation's revenues. He cultivated journalists. He had opinions about politics. He was, in the Harlem of the 1970s, a public figure. Frank Lucas was not a public figure. Frank Lucas was a ghost. The difference mattered less than Barnes believed, for as long as the political environment was what it was. But political environments change. The New York Times Magazine cover of November 6, 1977, was not an accident. Barnes had cultivated a relationship with the reporter who wrote the story. He had been, in the specific Nicky Barnes way, charming and open and quotable. He had allowed the photograph. He had approved his own image, the fur coat, the car, the sunglasses, the specific posture of a man performing in vulnerability. He believed the coverage was in his interest. The calculation was not entirely wrong. By the standards of the Harlem underground economy, public visibility had historically provided a certain kind of protection, not from law enforcement exactly, but from the specific, informal kind of accountability that made community-level criminal operations sustainable. A man who was known, who was recognized, who had a public presence, was harder to simply disappear. He had standing. He had the specific protection of being a figure. Barnes had beaten 4 arrests. He had a lawyer who was very good. He had, in his own assessment, demonstrated that he was genuinely untouchable, that the combination of his legal defense, his organizational structure, and his community relationships had made him immune to the consequences that had taken down lesser operators. He had not accounted for the magazine cover being seen by the President of the United States on a Sunday morning. This is the specific, irreducible absurdity of the Nicky Barnes story, that the federal resources that were eventually deployed against him were mobilized not through patient investigative work, but through a 4-minute phone call from the Oval Office, triggered by a magazine cover that Barnes himself had helped create. Jimmy Carter was not tracking Nicky Barnes. He had not been briefed on the specific complexities of the New York heroin trade. He had not read the DEA files. He had not been presented with a strategic case for why Barnes should be a priority target. He had read the Sunday paper. And what the Sunday paper showed him was a man who appeared to be daring the federal government to come after him, on the cover of the most prestigious magazine in the country, in a way that made the government look impotent and complicit. Carter's response was not sophisticated drug policy. It was the response of a man who felt, publicly and visibly, challenged. The President of the United States does not read a magazine cover that says Mr. Untouchable and conclude that the appropriate response is to allow the situation to continue. Barnes had chosen visibility because he believed it protected him. It destroyed him. The DEA, directed by explicit presidential mandate, assembled a prosecution team and a task force that had resources and priority that previous Barnes investigations had not. They built a RICO case, the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organization statute, which allowed prosecutors to charge an entire criminal organization rather than individual criminal acts, which made the compartmentalization of the counsel irrelevant because the charge was the organization itself, not any single transaction within it. The case took 4 months to build. Barnes was convicted in January 1978. Life in prison, no parole. He was 44 years old. Frank Lucas and Nicky Barnes are the defining contrast of Harlem's 1970s underground economy. Same neighborhood, same era. Comparable resources, comparable intelligence, comparable organizational capability. Two men who built operations of roughly comparable scale, who competed in overlapping markets, who had at various points been partners and rivals and the specific kind of adversaries who understand each other better than they understand most people. Different fates. Frank Lucas was arrested in January 1975, more than 2 years before Barnes. But his arrest came after 6 years of operation, after building the most sophisticated criminal organization in American history, after accumulating wealth and power and organizational depth that exceeded anything Barnes achieved. His arrest came because Richie Roberts spent 6 years building a case, patiently, methodically, without any presidential phone call, through the sustained application of investigative intelligence and operational persistence. Barnes was arrested because he put himself on the cover of a magazine. This is not a small difference. It is the entire difference. The invisible empire was hard to find because it was invisible. The investigation required 6 years because Frank Lucas gave it nothing to see. The arrest came as slowly as it did because every avenue Roberts pursued had been blocked by the operational security that Frank Lucas had built into everything he did. Barnes's operation was not invisible. It was, by Barnes's own choice, visible, celebrated, publicized, cultivated. The investigation that produced his conviction required 4 months, not because Barnes was less sophisticated than Lucas, but because he had given the investigators a gift that Frank Lucas had spent 6 years refusing to give. He had made himself a target. Frank Lucas, reading the news from his cell, had been this target once. The Super Bowl, the chinchilla coat. The one moment when the discipline of invisibility had given way to the hunger to be seen. He had paid for it with the acceleration of an investigation that might otherwise have taken longer to close. Barnes had made being that target his entire philosophy. The contrast is not simply tactical. It is psychological. It reflects 2 different relationships to the world that the underground economy created. Frank Lucas wanted the money and the power. He wanted to build something that would last and run and generate. The recognition was not the point. The recognition was, in fact, a liability that he had worked to avoid. Nicky Barnes wanted to be seen, wanted to be known, wanted to be the man who walked down 116th Street and had everyone acknowledge him. The money and the power were real, but they were instrumental. They were what produced the recognition that was the actual goal. This psychological difference produced a strategic difference that was, ultimately, lethal. Frank Lucas understood that the criminal world and the world of public recognition were incompatible. You could have one or the other. He chose the criminal world and paid its price. Wealth without acknowledgement, power without public standing, empire without a name on the building. Barnes tried to have both. The magazine cover was the moment when the incompatibility became impossible to avoid. Nicky Barnes served 9 years of his life sentence before he made a decision that, even in a world accustomed to cooperation agreements, was extraordinary in its scope and its apparent motivation. He decided to cooperate. Not the way Frank Lucas had cooperated, strategically, carefully, providing information that advanced specific prosecution goals while maintaining certain boundaries and certain protections. Barnes cooperated in a way that was total, comprehensive, and driven by something that was not simply the calculation of reduced exposure. Barnes cooperated for revenge. While Barnes was in prison, serving a sentence that would last the rest of his life, the council, the organization he had built, the men he had trusted, had not dissolved. It had continued operating, under new leadership, generating revenues that Barnes was no longer receiving. More specifically, the men who had been his partners, his lieutenants, his trusted associates, had not only continued without him but had, by Barnes's account, made clear that they considered his absence permanent and had arranged their affairs accordingly. Most damningly, several of his closest associates had entered into relationships with his wife. This is the detail that makes the Barnes cooperation story permanently distinct from every other major cooperation agreement in the history of the drug trade. Barnes did not cooperate primarily to reduce his sentence, though that was part of it. He cooperated primarily to destroy the men who had, in his view, betrayed him. His cooperation was thorough, detailed, personal. He provided information that led to the conviction of his former council partners, of associates at every level of the organization, of people who had been with him for years and whom he now described with a specific, precise recall of someone who had spent 9 years in a cell organizing his grievances. The cooperation produced dozens of convictions. It dismantled what remained of the council. It took down people who had survived the original investigation, who had built careers on top of what Barnes had built, who had believed that Barnes, life sentence, no parole, was no longer a threat. They were wrong. Frank Lucas, who had cooperated for strategic reasons and had maintained a kind of professional detachment from the cooperation process, is reported to have read about Barnes's cooperation with something between recognition and discomfort. Recognition, the cooperation made sense as an operation. If you are going to cooperate, cooperating fully and specifically is more effective than cooperating partially. Discomfort, the motivation, the revenge. The way Barnes had allowed the personal, the betrayal, the anger, the specific corrosive bitterness of a man who had built something and been robbed of it by the people he trusted, to drive a decision that, in Frank Lucas's framework, should have been made coldly. Frank Lucas had told Calvin Reed to talk because it was the right operational decision. Barnes told the government everything because he was furious. Both cooperations were effective, but they were different in their nature, and the difference revealed, one more time, the fundamental psychological contrast between the two men. Frank Lucas was an operator to the end. Nicky Barnes, even in cooperation, was someone for whom it was personal. Nicky Barnes was eventually released from prison. His cooperation agreement, combined with his sentences served, produced a release in 1998. He was 65 years old. He entered witness protection. He wrote a book. He gave interviews. He became, in his own post-prison life, another version of the public figure he had always wanted to be. The mythology of Nicky Barnes, Mr. Untouchable, the man who dared the president, was, in its way, as durable as the mythology of Frank Lucas. A documentary, a biopic, the specific American appetite for the story of a black man who built something extraordinary in a world that denied him legitimate pathways to build anything. The mythology preserved the fur coat and the magazine cover. It was less thorough about what the fur coat cost. Frank Lucas died in 2019. Nicky Barnes, as of the last available information, is still alive. They lived parallel lives through parallel eras and parallel neighborhoods, and their parallel stories illuminate the same fundamental truth from opposite directions. The truth is this: in the criminal world, as in every other world, there is a gap between what you are and what you appear to be. Managing that gap, controlling the distance between the reality of what you have built and what the world is allowed to see of it, is not simply a tactical concern. It is the operational core of survival. Frank Lucas spent his entire career maximizing that gap, making himself appear to be less than he was. The invisible man, the ghost, the man in the brown suit eating neck bones while running a $150 million empire. The gap was his protection. Nicky Barnes spent his career minimizing the gap, making himself appear to be exactly what he was, as powerful, as successful, as untouchable as he believed himself to be. The magazine cover was the gap closing entirely. The reality and the appearance perfectly aligned. On the front page of the New York Times Magazine, in a fur coat, daring Jimmy Carter to do something about it. Jimmy Carter did something about it. Frank Lucas had understood what Barnes had not, that in a world where the system is looking for a reason to destroy you, giving the system a reason is not a demonstration of power. It is the end of power. The magazine cover was not Mr. Untouchable declaring victory. It was Mr. Untouchable handing the President of the United States a phone number to call. Ego, Frank Lucas understood, was the most expensive thing a man in his position could afford. Nicky Barnes paid for it with the rest of his life.